The homeless man had been riding the same subway car for 3 hours. That should have been Morgan Freeman's first clue that this wasn't going to be an ordinary Tuesday morning commute. The 6 train heading uptown was packed with the usual crowd. Wall Street types checking their phones, college students with backpacks, tourists clutching maps and looking confused. But there, in the corner seat by the window, sat an elderly black man with clothes that had seen better decades, holding a worn leather journal like it contained the secrets of the universe. He had deep lines carved into his face that spoke of hard years, eyes that seemed to hold entire lifetimes of stories, and hands that trembled slightly as he wrote in his journal with careful, deliberate strokes. Every few stops, passengers would get off, and new ones would get on. But the man stayed, writing continuously like he was racing against time itself. Morgan noticed him at 42nd Street. How could he not? In a car full of people avoiding eye contact and hiding behind devices, this man sat with the kind of dignified presence that commanded attention without asking for it. He wore a faded blue button-down shirt that had been mended multiple times, shoes that were clean despite their age, and a baseball cap that looked like it had traveled 1,000 miles. Most passengers gave him the wide berth that New Yorkers typically reserved for anyone who looked like they might ask for something. But Morgan found himself oddly drawn to the man's intense focus, the way he seemed completely absorbed in whatever he was putting down on paper. When the train lurched to a stop at 59th Street and the doors opened, something happened that no one in the subway car had ever seen before. The homeless man looked up from his journal, made direct eye contact with Morgan Freeman, and spoke with the kind of clarity that cut through all the urban noise. "Excuse me, sir," he said, his voice carrying the unmistakable cadence of the Deep South. "I believe this belongs to you." He was holding out a single sheet of paper. Torn from his journal, filled with handwriting that looked like it had been crafted by someone who understood the weight that words could carry. Morgan felt every eye in the subway car turn toward him. In 40 years of public life, he'd developed instincts about when to engage and when to politely excuse himself. But something about this man's demeanor, not desperate, not demanding, just quietly certain, made Morgan set down his newspaper and pay attention. "I'm sorry, sir," Morgan said gently, "but I don't think we've ever met." The man smiled, not the practiced smile of someone working an angle, but the patient smile of someone who had lived long enough to understand that some conversations needed to unfold in their own time. "My name is Samuel Washington," he said, "and you're right, we've never met. But I've been carrying this letter for you for 15 years. The subway car had gone unusually quiet. Even in New York, where people prided themselves on minding their own business, everyone was listening now. Morgan leaned forward slightly. "I'm sorry, Mr. Washington, but I think there might be some confusion." "No confusion," Samuel interrupted gently. "This letter was written by my son, Marcus Washington. You might not remember the name, but 15 years ago you narrated a documentary about the Vietnam War. Marcus was a veteran. Purple Heart, Bronze Star. Came home broken but never stopped believing in the power of stories to heal people." Morgan's breath caught slightly. He'd narrated dozens of war documentaries over the years, but something about the way Samuel spoke made this feel different. "Marcus watched that documentary every night for 6 months, Samuel continued. Said your voice made him feel like someone understood what he'd been through. Said it was the first time since coming home that he didn't feel alone with his memories." The train swayed gently as it moved through the tunnel, but everyone in the car seemed suspended in time, drawn into Samuel's story like gravity pulling them toward something they didn't know they needed to hear. "Marcus wrote you a letter," Samuel said, holding out the paper. "Never sent it. Said some things were too important for the mail. Said he'd find a way to give it to you in person someday. Morgan took the letter with hands that weren't quite steady. The paper was soft from years of careful handling, and he could see it had been folded and unfolded many times. "Mr. Washington," Morgan said quietly, "where is Marcus now?" Samuel's eyes filled with tears, but his voice remained steady. Marcus took his own life 3 years after he wrote that letter. PTSD finally won the war he'd been fighting since he came home. The words hung in the air like a prayer. Morgan felt something heavy settle in his chest. Not just sadness, but the weight of responsibility he'd never known he carried. "But before he died," Samuel continued, "he made me promise something. He said, 'Dad, if you ever see Mr. Freeman, on TV, in person, anywhere, you give him this letter. You tell him his voice saved me for a while, and you tell him to keep using it because there are others out there who need saving too.'" Morgan unfolded the letter slowly. The handwriting was careful, controlled, the penmanship of someone who had learned discipline in the military and held on to it like a lifeline. "Mr. Freeman," it began, "I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I needed to write it anyway. Your voice has been my companion through the darkest nights of my life. When the nightmares came, when the memories got too heavy, I would play that Vietnam documentary and listen to you explain what happened over there. Not just the facts, but the humanity of it. You made me feel like my pain had a place in a larger story, like what I went through mattered to someone who understood the weight of difficult truths." Morgan continued reading, aware that every passenger in the subway car was hanging on his every expression. The letter went on for 2 full pages, describing how Marcus had struggled to readjust to civilian life, how he'd felt invisible and forgotten until he heard Morgan's narration of his experience. "I wanted you to know that your voice doesn't just tell stories. It builds bridges between people who feel lost and the rest of the world that's moved on without them. Thank you for helping me remember that I'm not just a broken soldier. I'm part of a human story that's bigger than my pain." When Morgan finished reading, he looked up to find Samuel watching him with the kind of patience that could only come from someone who had spent years carrying other people's burdens. "Mr. Washington," Morgan said, his voice rougher than usual, "I'm honored that Marcus found comfort in my work. But I have to ask, why are you riding the subway for 3 hours to give me this letter?" Samuel laughed, a sound that carried both grief and joy in equal measure. "Because I'm homeless, Mr. Freeman. Have been for 2 years now. But every morning I ride the trains and I write letters. To my son. To God. To anyone who might need to hear what I've learned about holding on to hope when everything falls apart." He gestured to his worn journal. "This train is my office. These passengers are my congregation, even if they don't know it. And today, God put you in my subway car so I could keep a promise to my boy." What happened next would be talked about for years among the subway workers and regular commuters who witnessed it. Morgan Freeman, the voice that had narrated humanity's greatest stories, stood up in a moving subway car and embraced Samuel Washington with the kind of respect typically reserved for heads of state. "Mr. Washington," Morgan said, "your son's letter means more to me than any award I've ever received. But I want to ask you something. What keeps you writing? What keeps you riding these trains and believing that your words matter?" Samuel smiled that patient smile again. "Because every person who gets on this train is carrying something heavy. Some carry it better than others, but we're all carrying something, and sometimes, the right words at the right moment can help someone carry their load a little easier." He opened his journal and showed Morgan page after page of careful handwriting. Letters to strangers, observations about human nature, prayers for people he'd watched struggle through their commutes. "I may not have a home," Samuel said, "but I've got a purpose. Marcus taught me that. said the worst thing that can happen to a person isn't losing everything. It's believing that their story doesn't matter anymore. Morgan felt something shift inside his chest, the same feeling he'd experienced years ago when he first understood that his voice could carry more than just words. It could carry hope. "Mr. Washington," Morgan said, pulling out his phone, "I want you to know that your story, Marcus's story, it needs to be heard by more people than just the passengers on this train." "What do you mean?" "I'm working on a documentary about veterans coming home. Would you let me tell Marcus's story? Would you help me make sure his voice is heard?" Samuel's hands shook as he wiped his eyes. Marcus would like that. He always said the best way to honor the dead is to make sure their stories help the living. As the train pulled into Morgan's stop at 86th Street, he realized he didn't want to get off. He wanted to keep riding with Samuel, listening to his stories, learning from his wisdom born of loss and transformed into purpose. But Samuel shook his head when Morgan hesitated at the doors. "Your stop is your stop, Mr. Freeman, but take this with you." He tore another page from his journal and handed it to Morgan. "Marcus's last words to me. I think you need to hear them too." Morgan took the paper and read, "Dad, don't let my story end with my death. Let it begin there. Let it become something that helps other people find their way home." As the subway doors closed and the train pulled away, Morgan stood on the platform, reading Marcus's words over and over. Later that day, he called his production team and told them they were adding a new segment to the documentary. Not about the war, but about the warriors who came home. About fathers who rode subway trains carrying their children's stories. About voices that refused to be silenced by death. 6 months later, Letters from the 6th Train premiered to critical acclaim. Samuel Washington was flown to Los Angeles for the premiere. His first time on an airplane, his first night in a hotel room in 3 years. During his acceptance speech, Morgan read Marcus's letter aloud to an audience of Hollywood's most powerful people. But the most important moment came afterward when Samuel approached the microphone and said simply, "My son Marcus believed that stories could save people. Tonight I know he was right." The documentary led to increased funding for veteran mental health services and a scholarship program for children of fallen soldiers. But for Morgan, the real impact was personal. He began taking the subway more often, not to get somewhere, but to listen. To the stories people carry. To the voices that need to be heard. And sometimes, when he's riding the trains late at night, Morgan thinks about Samuel Washington, who turned a subway car into a sanctuary, homelessness into ministry, and his son's death into a bridge to help other people find their way home. Because sometimes the most important stories aren't told in movie theaters or documentary films. Sometimes they're written in worn journals by men who've lost everything, but refuse to stop believing in the power of words to heal the broken places in people's hearts. Samuel looked up from his journal and spoke with a voice that had been weathered by decades of hard living, but still carried the unmistakable authority of someone who had earned the right to speak truth. "Mr. Freeman," he said, "can I tell you one more story about Marcus? Something I've never told anyone?" Morgan nodded, settling back into his seat. The train was approaching 96th Street, but neither man seemed to notice. When Marcus came back from Vietnam, he couldn't sleep. Not because of the nightmares, though he had plenty of those. He couldn't sleep because he said the silence was too loud. Said after months of helicopter blades and artillery fire, regular quiet felt like being buried alive. Samuel's weathered hands traced the edges of his journal as he spoke. "So every night, for 3 years, I would sit in his room and read to him. Newspapers, magazines, books, anything with words. My voice became his sleeping pills. And slowly, gradually, he started getting better. Morgan felt something tighten in his chest. What changed? I got old, Samuel said with a sad smile. My voice started giving out. Throat cancer took most of it in 1995. By the time Marcus really needed me to read to him again, when the PTSD got worse, I could barely whisper. The train pulled into 96th Street. Doors opened, passengers shuffled on and off. But Morgan and Samuel remained locked in their conversation. That's when Marcus found your documentaries, Samuel continued. He'd put on headphones, close his eyes, and listen to you narrate stories about war, about history, about human resilience. Said your voice was like having his father read to him again, except you understood the weight of what you were saying. Mr. Washington, Morgan said quietly. I had no idea. How could you? Samuel interrupted gently. But that's the thing about voices like yours.